Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters in Victoria. A momentous week in BC politics, the very fabric of time itself shattered by Premier David Eby, the clock king, if you will, single-handedly facing what we thought was the slow and inevitable march of time and saying, no more. British Columbia shall only recognize daylight saving time and never fall back again. A purely apolitical maneuver. There's nothing desperate about it, and that's why we have convened the Pod Squad to walk us through this and many other things this week. I already see Jeff frowning he's not frowning, but
smiling. I'm smiling.
Jeff is back. Angelo, Jillian are here. We got a lot to talk about this week. Let us begin by hearing from Premier David Eby on his decision to bring in permanent daylight saving time. All right, obviously that was just the Premier dancing for 15 seconds in a spectacular press conference that involved local children from an elementary school being told on command to dance to Daft Punk. A highlight or low light of the week, I can't tell which. Jillian, you live in what I would say is as close to the real world as you can get in this panel in Nelson, out away from Victoria. Daylight saving time announcement. Did you hear people talking about, did it resonate the way the government obviously hoped it would? Is this positive, long overdue, welcomed kind of announcement, or how do you think it landed?
Yeah, totally. I noticed people talking about it for sure, especially people who wouldn't normally bring up politics to me. I think, and overwhelming sort of relief, and I think speaks to exactly why the government chose to do it right now, because it's the kind of thing that in a time where people feel really alienated from government decisions, when it seems like government is making so many decisions that don't make sense, they're like, okay, there's a moment of sanity that resonates with me and feels like the government is being decisive. So I think it definitely did land the way that they were hoping. We'll see how long-lasting any kind of boost that they got from that is. I think it's probably more a bit of a branding kind of type thing if there are going to be any more long-lasting effects. I guess it has the added benefit of other jurisdictions having them every 6 months, so we can be reminded about our smugness of being first out of the gate to eliminate it. I think there's other details. Obviously, business community wasn't that excited about not being given a heads up. Scientists and experts saying we should have gone with staying on standard time like Saskatchewan, because that's better for our circadian rhythm and for kids walking to school in the morning. But I think all in all, it was a break in case of emergency kind of tool that the NDP have been keeping, and was probably a decent time to deploy it.
Yeah, hidden behind glass, smash when needed sort of thing. Angelo, you have a small child, a baby, if you will. Do you anticipate this being a problem for you in the world of time changes, good or bad? Is it resonating the way Jillian said? Do you think there was any desperation in it? What did you make of it?
Well, personally, my daughter doesn't sleep at all at night anyhow, so it doesn't make much of a difference. But in terms of the issue, I mean, look, if I were advising the Premier and the NDP, and we had just presented one of the worst budgets in history, the worst deficit in history, the worst debt in history, an assault on seniors, an assault on families with children with autism, I would look for something to change the channel and change it fast. And you saw in the clip, right, the Premier dancing with a bunch of kids and talking about, this time change it's a good way to try to do that. It's not without its issues. As Jillian said, the business community hasn't been receptive. I know YVR, the airports have had some commentary on it. I'll note and give a shout out to Scott McInnes, our East Kootenay MLA, who made note that the East Kootenays are effectively excluded from this. And in some ways, it makes their life a little more complicated. So it's not without its issues, but it is definitely a break in case of emergency. move by the Premier.
Technically, we learned this, that cities can choose their own time zone in British Columbia, and some of them in the north and the east will, as you mentioned there. I'm sure someone in Victoria Council is considering an alternate time zone just to be difficult. Jeff, what did you think of the announcement and sort of how it landed and how it was delivered and the reaction to it?
I think it's a tremendously popular decision that's been made by government. It's timely because the spring forward is about to happen. And sometimes governments do popular things. It's good to see all party support for this. You have 93% of British Columbians in a government survey saying they support it. The opposition, BC Conservatives, to their credit, brought in a private member's bill. John Rustad brought it in, the very famously named Interpretation Uniform Pacific Time Zone Amendment Act.
Rolls off the tongue.
Where Ward Stamer said, how can the Premier claim he is elbows up against becoming the 51st state while allowing the U.S. to dictate how we set our clocks? We're taking ownership of that. It's happening. BC's showing leadership. Saskatchewan's done it before. Yukon's done it before. It's worked well. It's worked well for the economy. It's worked well for families. It's timely. People wanted it. Government's doing it.
I will say on that number, and the Premier cited that number, which is correct from the 2019 survey of British Columbians. The other number in that survey was that 56% of British Columbians didn't think it was a good idea unless everyone acted together. And the Premier did put a letter out this week urging the three governors of Oregon and California and Washington State to please follow him, saying that the Cascadia region needs to be unified for its tourism and its economies to remain in alignment, which I thought was kind of interesting. We didn't really hear that from him at the press conference, that there might be economic issues with it. Let's just go around again. There was some pushback. Is it legitimate, do we think, that British Columbia on its own time change hurts the economy in any way, Jillian, or is it detriment to film and other sectors where you sort of require communication over time zones?
It's going to be messy, I think. But I think at the end of the day, we'll probably sort itself out. We've seen other jurisdictions, like you noted, go ahead with this, and they seem to be doing okay. There's cities and towns in BC that have exempted themselves from the change for years, for decades, and everything's worked out okay. I have another town just half an hour down the road for me that actually doesn't observe it, and it's just kind of like a funny quirk, and people get used to it. So I think at the end of the day, it'll shake out. And honestly, as a British Columbian, I think it's kind of a breath of fresh air to see us go first on something and take leadership. I think there's a good argument and a good appetite for not just following what the U.S. is doing right now.
I pity the people in Point Roberts, where in Delta, where you go across the border down to get some gas, and suddenly you're going to go backwards in time between November and March as our American neighbors are out of sync. Angelo, the Alberta Premier, did come out and say she's thinking about this as part of this. Maybe BC's going to single-handedly change the world on this and move provinces and states, or maybe it's not. Is there any political pushback or fallout if it doesn't?
I think it's good to lead, right? I mean, not just Alberta. You look at Washington State, Oregon. Are they going to follow suit, right? Instead of, again, as Jillian said, following what the Americans do, I think it is good that we took the first step forward. But in terms of the reactions, I mean, I do think it'll shake out in the end. I think that, the business community is overall just frustrated at the economic situation in the province, and they see this as a distraction. But overall, this is something that I think vast majority of British Columbians seem to be in favor of.
Jeff, are you excited about being able to go to Trader Joe's and go backwards in time and get the Lotto 649 numbers and then be able to win and using time manipulation?
I'm looking forward to going to Kiniski Reef in Point Roberts.
That's a good place.
The restaurant named after Gene Kiniski, Canada's greatest athlete, run by his kids. Look, I think the economic argument, I understand where boards of trade and business interests are coming from. It is going to be messy, as Angelo and Jillian have said. It strikes me, though, that the bigger economic threat from the U.S. is that their president wants to take us over. Now, there hasn't been a lot of criticism of this on the panel, so let me just say that I'm going to miss fallback. I think fallback is the best day of the year. Get an extra hour's sleep. We're going to lose out on that. We'll see what the public opinion is of this daylight savings times the day after the day we're supposed to get an extra hour's rest on a Saturday night.
Yeah, that's in November, so we'll see what happens there. Okay, we're going to take a break on this. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the other big issue this week, the Aboriginal rights and title deal with the Musqueam Indian Band that caught the province off guard. Coming up after this.
To the best of my understanding, the provincial government was not briefed at the political level on this. I can't say whether or not at this stage whether any public service members had line of sight to it. I certainly didn't.
The Premier is actually at the signing ceremony.
Just to be absolutely clear, received no briefings about the content of this agreement. No heads up from the federal government.
The federal minister says, and I quote, "The federal government did brief the provincial government, and it was a number of weeks ago."
My understanding is there was a verbal, they were having a conversation about something else, and a junior staffer was told, oh, we're going to be making an announcement with Musqueam on Friday.
All right, that was just some of the back and forth this week between Premier David Eby, Opposition Leader Trevor Halford, Indigenous Relations Minister Spencer Chandra Herbert on who knew what and when in the BC government about a deal between Ottawa and the Musqueam that recognizes Aboriginal rights and title over a traditional territory that includes most of Metro Vancouver, and a lot of anxiety coming out of that because of the private property and Aboriginal title Cowichan Nation ruling. So this seemed to be, just to pick up on the last topic, which was changing the channel with daylight savings time. It seemed like the channel changed to a worse channel for government on Musqueam. Angelo, like what happened here? And as you're watching it play out during the week and this kind of daily sort of like, what did you think of that?
Well, it reminds me of an episode of Veep, really, if you ever watched that show, in the sense that it's political comedy. You know, you have this announcement that the federal government has made an agreement with the Musqueam. You have a reaction in the news and the public right away. The Conservatives bring it up in question period, and the Premier and the Minister get up and say, we had no idea about this. We had no idea this was happening. And then just hours later, they come out and say, actually, we were at the signing of the agreement, but we didn't know what was being signed. We just sort of waltzed in and sat there and enjoyed ourselves. And then after that, we discovered that actually they were briefed on exactly what was happening. So it's odd, and it begs the question, is it incompetence or is it intentional? A bigger question is really, why is the federal government not including the province even more on this decision outside of a briefing, right? If we're negotiating title with, one of the most prominent bands in the province, the federal government didn't even give us a seat at the table. So that's a wholly separate issue from sort of the political theater of the fact that the Premier and the NDP attempted to dodge this and say they had nothing to do with it when they were at the signing agreement. Mm-hmm. So you knew about it, and the whole thing was a blunder and an own goal.
In some ways, Jeff, like, it had nothing to do with the BC government, as Angelo pointed out. It's a federal Musqueam deal, but then the government sort of trying to say it didn't have anything to do with it when it kind of almost did, became the story, and then we lost sight of what this actually was or wasn't. It just turned into a big mess, it seemed like.
Good to see that Ottawa has finally clued in that Indigenous relations is a bit of a flashpoint issue in British Columbia. I know they have 20 plus MPs, including lots of folks in the area that we're talking about. And now they've finally understood that clear, transparent communication's important about it. I think governments need to communicate openly and transparently on First Nations consultation agreements now more than ever. The truism in communications that absent communication, everything is negative. If you want to talk about Eby and how he handled it, I think his mistake was speaking definitively without doing the due diligence needed to speak definitively, and that's where they fell into some problems this week. I think there's some broader issues here, though, around why is First Nations so in the target area of the opposition? They criticize government for housing and affordability and say First Nations want to steal our homes and stop us from using public parks, even while First Nations are taking flack for building a lot of housing in big cities and while they seek to conserve sensitive lands for the benefit of us all. So Eby's going to own this on this issue, but I think there's some tough questions for the opposition about why they are so fixated on First Nations.
Well, let's just come back to that. But Jillian, just want to bring you in on this. The way that it played out, let's start there and then we'll go to the issue. But like, what were you thinking as you saw this, just days and days and days of this getting worse and worse?
Yeah, it was pretty surprisingly sloppy for the BC government. I think it's not surprising that Ottawa didn't spare a brain cell for considering our political dynamics. It's like they don't even watch our show. But I think on the premier and the provincial government side, they've had a lot of staffing changes in the PO. The head of the DRIPA Secretariat recently left. And sometimes things are happening behind the scenes and you don't see that. And in this case, the premier said he was there in his capacity as a local MLA. It was a Friday. That is the day that MLAs usually spend in their constituencies, and they have a different staff that might not be as aware of political nuance. However, that being said, for a premier to attend an event and not be briefed on the substance of it is pretty shocking. And I think it's like, obviously a lot of balls got dropped to have that happen. And I think, down to the premier himself, that should have raised a red flag of, oh, maybe I should know what this is about. So I think that's, disappointing, but probably indicative of some of the inner turmoil that we've seen behind the scenes in those offices.
The technical explanation from government was that a junior staffer had been briefed by Ottawa, but failed to elevate it up the line. And as Minister Spencer Chandra Herbert said, well, what are we supposed to do about that? I don't think punching down on staff is a great look by this government either. Like, that's ministerial responsibility. You either run your ministry or you don't. But some junior staffer, as Vaughn Palmer, my colleague, put it, is probably tied to a chair in the basement of a government building right now, being re-educated by New Democrats on how to properly brief the premier on sensitive issues. I feel bad for that person. Let's just go around again, because Jeff touched on this, the larger debate here. And Jeff made the point that the opposition is using it, Angelo, weaponizing it in a way. I think there's a lot of split legal opinions out there that are causing massive confusion. There are people who are calling the agreement one thing that maybe doesn't do, or it does do, or well, I don't even actually know what it does because Ottawa didn't explain that. The issue of Aboriginal rights and title right now, can we talk about it? Is it like, where does it sit? Is it destined to become this just intense, emotional flashpoint, or what do you think of the issue?
Oh, I think it's destined to be a massive issue for British Columbians and Canadians, right? I mean, we can talk about intent all we want. We can talk about how the intention is to not seize private property, but what matters is the law. And in the Cowichan ruling, it's very clear that, frankly, it isn't clear. There's ambiguity. What's clear is that there's uncertainty around private property rights. Mm-hmm. And to such a degree that even the mayor of Richmond sent out a letter to every resident in that area saying your private property is at risk. So we can talk about the intent of these bans saying, no one's coming for your home. But what matters is the law, and what matters is the precedent that is being set. And we know that title is also part of this federal deal. So we take it very seriously. It's not just a matter of your home and your land. It's a matter of how we structure our country and our province. And it strikes at the core of what it means to be Canadian and the freedoms that we have and the ownership that we have. So I think we need to have a very serious and broad conversation about private property rights.
Jeff, even if we didn't have an opposition and there's just a bunch of lawyers disagreeing on this and whatever, are we destined to, is this issue itself just politically a flashpoint that we can't get around, do you think?
Well, I think it's been made a political flashpoint through the efforts of an opposition with political reasons for doing it. I think a serious conversation about the law starts with acknowledging that it's the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, which gives First Nations rights and title over their lands. And you can get rid of UNDRIP, you can get rid of DRIPA, and that's not going to change. I'd argue that instead of vilifying First Nations as thieves and bullies, that the better way is to work with First Nations to help solve some of the problems in BC today, as we're seeing in housing, as we're seeing in land conservation, as we're seeing in economic development. But thanks to ambitious right-wing politicians, the people whose fears they're tapping into, that doesn't seem to be in the cards.
Jillian, what do you think of this issue? Is it, at UBCM, lawyers briefed, local politicians and have dramatically different issues about what rights and title mean. We have the court ruling in Cowichan, which is intensely confusing. but also raises anxiety. You have the provincial government backstopping mortgages that may or may not be at risk in one part of the province on an issue that expands to other part. You have the Squamish Nation coming out and saying there's overlapping issues with Musqueam. Like, is it being weaponized, do you think, politically, or is it just also just confusing? And is it a political issue, I guess, is the question.
I think it's both. I think that it is confusing, and that both the federal government, in the case of the Musqueam agreement, and the provincial government in some of these previous rulings and agreements that we've talked about, have not been clear about the outcome and what is on the table and what's not on the table. And I think the way that this was handled by the province this week, is not helpful. And because when there is a breakdown in trust, when anything seems like it's trying to be obfuscated or hidden, then it raises questions. I also agree with Jeff that it has been politicized to a greater degree by many right-wing politicians. And they're seizing on that uncertainty to create doubt and further mistrust in the government. It's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube in those kinds of situations. I think there's more that we could be doing to be working together as all parties in good faith. Is there a way that we can have an all-party committee about this to get opposition MLAs briefed on agreements so that it doesn't have to be this secrecy, that it doesn't seem to the public and the opposition and the media like it's coming as a surprise every time? How can we get out of this cycle? Because I think that for the public, most people want to see reconciliation, but they want certainty as well. And is there a way that we can kind of harmonize those two goals to move forward?
Yeah, I think the secrecy which previous Indigenous issues, from the Land Act to the Heritage Conservation Act to the bunch of other changes, were done by the province, has kind of created this distrust that seems to permeate into issues that are totally unrelated, but seem to be kind of putting everyone behind the eight ball at the start of a discussion again and again. So I think that's the context for it. We're out of time. Thank you to the panel for being here. Thank you for watching. We've got some audio extras in the podcast coming up that you might want to subscribe to. And we will be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.